having connectivity issues. Is everybody back?
Yep.
Okay. So, where was I? Okay, our topic for today is intersections of web archiving and records management. I'm Kate Stratton from the Gates Archive in Seattle. John Bentz is going to be facilitating along with me, and he's at Emory University. This is going to be a moderated QA session. We'll be talking to some practitioners who are involved in two projects that integrate web archiving and records management. If you're watching us live, please feel free to contribute questions to the dialogue using the Twitter hashtag RMRTWA. Also, if you're interested in viewing the Hangout again, it'll be available on the Records Management YouTube channel. So, John, would you go ahead and introduce our presenters, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So with us today we have Christie Peterson, who's Records Management Archivist at Johns Hopkins University. Christie will be talking about her involvement in a project to increase historic knowledge and current documentation of student life on campus, which obviously incorporated web archiving to capture the records of student activities and student involvement at her institution.
Also, if you're interested in viewing the Hangout again, it'll be available on the Records Management YouTube channel. So, John, would you go ahead and introduce our presenters, please?
Sure, absolutely. And Christie Peterson, Jessica Meyerson, Digital Archivist at the Briscoe Center for American History. We'll be talking about her involvement in a project to increase historic knowledge and current documentation of student life on campus, which obviously incorporated web archiving to capture the records of student activities and student involvement at her institution.
Also, if you're interested in viewing the Hangout again, it'll be available on the Records Management.
Sorry.
So, John, would you go ahead and introduce our presenters, please?
Sure, I'm doing that, right? And Christie Peterson, Jessica Meyerson, Digital Archivist at the Briscoe Center for American History. We'll be talking about her involvement in a project to increase historic knowledge and current documentation of student life on campus, which obviously incorporated web archiving to capture the records of student activities and student involvement at her institution.
Also, if you're interested in viewing the Hangout again, it'll be available on the Records Management.
Sorry.
So, John, would you go ahead and introduce our presenters, please?
Sure, I'm doing that, right? Sorry, you bear with us for a minute. I think we'll get this Digital Archivist at the Briscoe Center for American History. You'll get to hear it again. Involved in a project to increase historic knowledge and current documentation of student life on campus, which obviously...
Guys, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please hold on just one moment.
And student involvement at her institution.
Also, if you're interested in viewing the Hangout again, it'll be available on the Records Management.
Should I just close it?
So, John, would you go ahead?
Okay.
Maybe
Well,
we left the feedback loop, although we've also lost Jessica. We'll give her a couple of seconds to join us back up. But thank you for your patience as we work through what seem to be inevitable technical difficulties.
Well, I'll wait to introduce them when they get back. But so, Christie, do you want to start then?
Okay. Sure. Oh, there's Jessica. Hey, guys.
We're back.
Okay. Well, okay, I'll go ahead and introduce you guys since that's where we left off. We have Jessica Meyerson, Digital Archivist at the Briscoe Center for American History. Maryrose Hightower-Coyle, who's University Records Management Officer, and Jenn Coast, a web strategist in Information Technology Services, and they're from the University of Texas at Austin. They're going to discuss their experience developing a cross-departmental working group to create a strategy for preserving the institutional domain and its many, many, I'm sure, subdomains. Their working group includes members of Information Technology Services, Records Management, University Archives, University Libraries, and University Communications. So that'll be great to hear about. And I think we decided you guys will go first if you feel free to launch in and tell us about that working group and how it's sort of developed.
Sure. Jen, would you like to introduce University Communications' role into the project?
Yeah, I work in information technology services, but I'm a liaison with the University Communications department, and within ITS, we're doing a project, multi-year project to replace our web hosting infrastructure that has been around for about 2 decades. We've upgraded it and updated it, but it's still the same content. I believe it actually started out as a Gopher server, so there is some of that information still housed on the server. So when we started the project, we reached out to University Communications to say we have 2 terabytes of data, over almost 300,000 directories, and 800 unique sites hosted on our central server. That's not including all of the department sites that are not centralized. I'm only concerned about central. And so we reached out to him and said, hey, we need some help with content strategy. And Mike Horn, the director of digital strategy, reached out to the records manager, and that was the start. We've probably been meeting for about a year, right, and trying to figure out the content strategy for many of these pages that do not need to be around anymore.
Yeah, so it's combining historical preservation and records management under the same web archiving scope, and that's sort of been the central focus of our working group.
Great. And Christie, if you'll sort of speak to what you've been doing around student activity at AHU.
Yeah, so I was part of a project this last semester. Actually, it was a longer project, but a part of the project that's relevant for this was this last semester, where we were making a concerted effort to take in records from student life, student clubs on campus. It was an area that we had not collected heavily from in the past, and we wanted to rectify that. So as part of that, I was doing little miniature records management consults with the student groups, kind of talking about what records do they create, what formats are they kept in, what are their essential records, their founding records, things like that, and talking to them about sending them to the archives. What we found out through that process was that 201, every one of them are really heavily online, no big surprise. But somewhat surprisingly, almost all of them were keeping what I would consider vital records in web formats. So things like officers' lists, meeting minutes, records, their calendars, what they were doing. Those things existed on websites, they existed on Facebook pages, in Twitter feeds, even in Instagram. All those documentations of what they're doing that used to come out in things like posters and newsletters, things of that nature. So I started archiving those. I worked with, I think it was 7 groups this last semester, kind of test piloting, and I'm planning this next fall to hire an undergraduate student to kind of do some reconnaissance for me on, there's 170 some student groups on campus, and to go and actually track down what are the 3, sometimes 4 or 5 web presences for each one of these groups, and at least once do a capture across all of them. I'm going to make it opt-out for all of the student groups. I'm going to contact them and say, hey, this is our plan. We're only crawling publicly available stuff. My experience so far has been that the student groups are they're smart about what it means to have a public web presence, and they're okay with public stuff going into the archives. So I'm not expecting to have too much blowback from that, excuse me. But I am going to notify them before we do it. The other thing that I do is I do records management for the university, and unlike Maryrose over at UT Austin, our records management program here is really in its infancy. So I kind of think of it like, I'm going to borrow a term from Christie Sorensen at the Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. She talks about records management as a service, in which you go out and you solve the problems of the offices And so that's what I do, and I'm using web archiving in that context also, so I can talk about that as well. I don't want to eat up too much time at this point.
John and Kate, can we follow up a little bit with some of the things that Christie has brought up in her introduction?
Of course.
So on our end, I think one interesting difference, as Christie mentioned, is that we have a legal responsibility, a state requirement, and Maryrose will speak more to this, to do records management. So as part of that, sort of combining historical preservation and records management under the same web archiving scope, our primary deliverable over this last, I guess it's been this last academic year, is to come up with a web retention policy that will then be published on the web for primary usage by webmasters. So if Maryrose, if you want to talk a little bit maybe about that, and also web records retention codes that have been developed as part of that larger project as well.
Okay. Well, I'll just say that as a public institution, we have to be accountable for the content that we publish, and we fall under open records laws. So in order to be able to dispose of anything at all, we have to have a systematic way to describe how we're going to destroy things and a process to document the destruction. So we must have some kind of strategy for naming the content and naming its retention requirement in order to dispose of any of it. And we have to record the destruction or the transfer to archives. We have to document the transfer or document the destruction and keep that documentation for 10 years. So in order to implement that, we have to make sure that we can describe the content in records retention series. So we've created 2 retention series to describe our published web content as a publication of the university. So our outward-facing public content is a web publication and has all the characteristics of a state publication and all the requirements for that. And web publication has a retention period that's prescribed by the state. And then we also address internally facing intranet documentation. Our internal wikis and other kind of intranet communications that happen among staff. We also have to describe that. So that's kind of the base for us. But then there's just all the different kinds of content. Actually, some will have a longer retention requirement than the requirement for simply a publication. We have to look at all those pieces.
That's really fascinating. And there are a few things I want to pick up on what you follow up with on about what you were saying. One of which I want to bring back to Christie. You were talking a lot, or Maryrose, you were talking a lot about the retention schedule. And Christie, you are not under any sort of statutory requirements for bringing the content in. How did you go about? How are you dealing with scoping or collection policies? Are you bringing that into? How are you bringing that into your web collecting?
That's a great question. So, unlike them, unlike UT Austin, we're not a state school. We don't have open records laws that require us to be maintaining this. However, we do want to be maintaining it, portions of the website at least, for historical purposes. The question of scope, I think, is a really interesting one. I've had a number of people say things to me like, oh, so you're just capturing the entire university domain. No. No, we're not doing that, and we don't have any intention to be doing that. Not to be flippant about it, but there's someone who's already doing that, who's out there, whose job, it's the Internet Archive is capturing everything. Our job in the university archives is to capture things that we believe are critical or of enduring historical value, and that's not necessarily the entire website. So unlike what Maryrose was talking about, we don't have one retention period for the entire web presence. Instead, I see the website as a medium, and the content is the series. The content is what gets scheduled. So, for example, one office that I was working with, they had newsletters, and we had decided that their newsletters we did want to retain schedule for permanent retention. And so I worked with them to capture those newsletters. But other portions of their website, for example, their contact information, or they had pictures that they posted there that we were capturing other ways. We were capturing the originals of the photographs. So maybe those portions of the websites we wouldn't necessarily want to capture. Or I know another one, there's another office that I work with that has a YouTube channel. But the YouTube channel is actually things that the director of that office finds and flags for other people, so it's not original content that they're generating. So we would not consider that YouTube channel to be permanent content, whereas someone else's YouTube channel we might. So it's, I would definitely admit that this is not going to scale. I can't keep doing these boutique assessments at each office, but as the program is growing, I've been here not quite 2 years, and we're at a point where we are able to start making some strategic decisions. So I would say that we're going to be able to, in the near future, start doing things like putting guidance out for types of offices and, academic departments. This is what we've seen in the past. This is what you're likely to have. This is what our recommendations would be in those circumstances, type of things, to try to scale up. We can talk about QA in a minute. We use Archive.it, and I don't think it would ever be feasible for us, honestly, to capture the entire domain and to do quality QA on it and to maintain it in a way that was what we would want from a historical record. Did that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And I'm gonna follow up again and bring it back to UT. Christie, you mentioned you're using Archive.it, and I was curious when the UT folks were talking about your intranet and the necessity to pull documents from internal sources. Have you explored the tools that you might be using for that too, or are you considering using? I'll leave it open-ended. What are you doing in terms of tools for your intranet site?
So this is directed towards us, guys? Yeah. Not a follow-up for Christie, just to clarify?
Yes.
Okay. So on our end, it's going to look like we'll probably have more than one strategy for crawling different, well, I shouldn't say crawling, capturing different kinds of content. So as it stands right now, we are pre-proposal for our crawling service. So we are in the process of developing a proposal for content that can be crawled easily, such as public-facing content. And even some of those, depending on how Ajaxy they are, may or may not be crawled successfully. However, I've spoken with both CDL's Was and also a partner, a customer or user partner from Archive.it in regards to do we simply add the IP from which Heritrix is running in order for you guys to get past the firewall. I think that in both of those cases there's been some experimentation with working out, coming up with a workaround for crawling some internal content. But I think this raises the question too that we're looking at in terms of weighing the pros and cons and the costs either way of having kind of coming at it from multiple directions for different kinds of content, one of those directions being a subscription service, and the other being running Heritrix in-house and creating some sort of tool for Q&A, some administrative tool for Q&A in-house. Because if we run Heritrix, much like University of North Texas does in-house, because you're running it from a campus IP, I think there are fewer issues with capturing a lot of that internal content. So, you know, we're sort of looking at the best way to do that for those different kinds of content, and what is the most feasible thing for us to do that will scale for us, because it is such a huge volume of content. And then we also have this content that will be entering its records retention period fairly soon. Once it's retired, the old Web Central will be retired. That will be pre-crawl content that will be captured and moved into its retention holding cell, and then later on some subset of that into the university archives. So that's more like, you know, Christie and our group spoke a little bit yesterday about using wget or transferring those directories directly, maybe through FTP or from hard drive, and literally walking over it and transferring it to some other long-term storage solution. So, but then with that content, there is this question of, when you're taking the whole thing, how do you make that accessible? You know, with work files, it's very much, you can use the Wayback Machine, people can access the content that way, but when you're taking on the whole thing, how do you turn that around? Do you just rehost it? I mean, that sounds like that certainly wouldn't scale. So how do you make it accessible in the reading room or online or whatever it happens to be? I don't know if you guys have anything else to say about the capture tools.
For the capture tools, we had talked a little bit about, primarily our focus is on our central hosting platform, but we are trying to plan for other platforms. We have an internal portal, the intranet portal, and we had talked about that is only a portal to other places that hold the official information. So we're not necessarily concerned with capturing that, because that we don't have to follow.
It points to its the original record.
Yeah.
And that would be at everyone's university. I'm sure you log on with your university identification, username and password, and then you have access to things like timesheets or the university calendar of events, or modules, learning modules that are hosted out of continuing education, something analogous to that. And all of that content lives elsewhere. It's not stored within that body of stuff. That's just a portal to where all of that other content is hosted.
And I'll throw in that we also have other platforms. We have a wikis platform that is run, it uses Atlassian, and that has revisions built in, and you never have to delete pages. You can delete them, but you don't have to purge them. So we're talking about ways to have a recommendation and a best practice for, sure, you can delete it from your site so it's no longer publicly available, but you cannot purge it for 2 years to meet the records retention requirements. We still haven't figured out what we're going to do for transferring that to university archives, but at least we've pondered it, and the platform makes it, there's an easy tool already to retain that. Yeah.
So I kind of have a follow-up for both of you, and I guess I'll start with Jen and Maryrose and Jessica, but sort of, you know, the specific or unexpected challenges. You know, Jen, you were talking about sort of the website's old and the content hasn't been reviewed in a long time, and then also Maryrose has these retention requirements. And are there unexpected challenges sort of having those meet in the middle, or is that like or is it easier that I'm sort of putting it forth there, or, you know, so just some takeaways from what you've already started doing on that?
So I'll start with how the challenges of having 20-year-old content and now realizing that we still have to meet the records retention policy for it. So what we've done as a working group is we've come up with a definition for web content. So web content is anything that is displayed via HTML, CSS, programming or scripting languages. It includes website assets. We've a definition, that will go through our IT governance for approval, as well as the state archive or state records management.
Yes. Yeah, all of our retention queries are certified by the state. So that means the state archivist looks at it, and the state records management services looks at it. So they have to approve what and they've done some pre-reviewing of it. So they're on board with what we're developing. But this is at the state government level that we have.
Yeah. So once we define what constitutes web content, then we were trying to come up with the definition of how long you have to maintain it, which is 2 years, unless it is the official university record for such thing as a policy or a service level agreement, and it's the only record. And our policies are now online solely, so policies would not have to fit into this policy. They would be beyond it. They have 5 or 7 years retention. So we've done the policy for website content, and then we've done all the caveats if you have something else. And with the retention of 2 years, we do not want to store 2 terabytes of data for 2 years if it hasn't been updated in 15 years. So then we worked on a definition for what does inactive mean from a website record point of view, and basically if we've moved it into an archive directory, specifically labeled archive, which we realized would help with transferring it to university archives. If you've published a notification on it that it is no longer maintained and is only kept for historical purposes, so it's an in-place archive, or you move it and restrict it from public access, or this is the best one. You determine that it is obsolete by identifying that the record was last updated, edited, or modified 3 or more years ago and no longer contains information that is current or correct. So that was our catch-all way that we could say, yeah, we don't want something from 15 years ago. It's of no value from a records management perspective and of no value from a university archives. So that is how we met in the middle.
Gotcha. Yeah. And thank you. And then Christie, sort of probably a different set of challenges. And you already sort of talked about scope and appraisal. But is that the main challenge, or is there another one you haven't talked about, or a little bit more on that?
I was just going to mention that Jenn was talking earlier about different plant techniques for capturing websites, and I'm also not only using Archive.it, I'm also used wget. In rare cases, I'm trying to make those the exceptions. So, although we have a hosted solution, and I will say that their partner support is excellent, it's not a point-and-shoot type of thing. If you've done web archiving before, there's a lot that goes into QA, and there's a lot that goes into following up and making sure that the URLs that you were using last time are still valid. There's just a lot of overhead to it. I like to think of records management as you schedule it and you kind of walk away and it's on autopilot and you check in every year when stuff's supposed to come to you. This takes a lot more tending and nurturing than that. I've had particular challenges with one website that they had a URL change, and so there was this infinite redirect loop going on, and for some reason Heritrix was having issues with it. But one of the advantages of having the hosted solution is the subscription service is that I was able to contact them, and they were extremely responsive about pinpointing what was going on there and what I could do to rectify the situation. I had another circumstance where I was trying to capture Instagram, and it was only capturing the first, 10 or so Instagrams on a feed. And I contacted them, and they said, oh, well, guess what? Our engineers are working on Instagram right now. And 2 weeks later, they got back to me, and they had an improved solution for capturing it. So I would say the challenges that I've had have been primarily technological, beyond the scope and beyond knowing what to capture and appraisal and all that. The technological stuff other problems. I would say it has not been. It's not insurmountable, but it's more than I expected.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think you're alone in the challenges you've experienced on social media, but I also in social networking sites, and I want to continue along that line to ask both groups how you're coping with the rights issues that are inherent, I think, in dealing with social media. I think, Christie, clearly you are doing it. I don't know, you are crawling social media sites or networking sites for the folks at University of Austin, University of Texas at Austin. Are you crawling your official Twitter feed, communications Twitter feed, anything like that?
So with our social media accounts that are sort of university social media accounts, part of our responsibility as a working group will be, now that we have our general web retention policy in place, and you guys can both speak to this, it will be creating a statement that goes on, that's published alongside any social media content that is sort of like, if you're going to be creating comments on this blog, or if you're going to be commenting on an image on Instagram or Twitter, that you have acknowledged the fact that this, could potentially be made accessible again after transfer to the university archives. So I think they're sort of coming up with some general language moving forward on making sure that there's sort of a informed consent about, at least from our perspective, for creating content that's going on a university-vetted social media account. And, we're looking, this kind of goes back to the tool question as well. It was interesting to hear about Christie's experience crawling those social media sites. And we're sort of wondering, since there's been specific development in regards to improving capture that Archive It has evidently worked on for Instagram specifically, that would definitely factor into thinking about what it would mean to host Heritrix locally and try and capture those same sites. So those are all things that we'll have to account for, but from a policy perspective, that would be the next phase of language that would be specific, that we would need to develop as part of our working group responsibilities. And I don't know if either of you two want to add. We also, we've looked at some examples. So for the city of Austin, we were telling Christie that there's a social media portal on the City of Austin website, and they're using a service called Archive Social. And it'll just be interesting to do some comparison between the success, basically piloting those tools' success, in-house crawling test versus an Archive It or Was crawl versus, if we can get some sort of pilot subscription or sample subscription to that tool, and just seeing, what combination of things is going to help us to capture what we need to capture, and what's feasible for us to commit ourselves to. So that would sort of be our response on that piece.
And I guess my response would be that as of yet, I'm not capturing any official university feeds. The ones that I'm capturing so far, the social media, have all been student groups. And I have their, to this point, explicit consent. Like, actually, I have them sign a donor. I did a special donor form that has a space on it for, these are the websites that you're giving me permission to crawl in doing this. And this fall, I'm going to, like I said, probably go to an opt-out, but explicitly notify them that we're planning on doing this, and give them links to the Internet Archive, which I was really surprised a lot of students don't even know exists. So kind of give them a sample of, this is what it will look like, this is what we're talking about, and give them the chance to decide for their organization to opt out of that. Yeah, but I need my own working group like you guys have with the university-wide question. I have to say, I'm really inspired by the teamwork you guys have, and I'm going to go find my equivalent of Jenn here at the university.
Well, Christy, you can also be an honorary member of our working group.
Oh.
Oh, wait. So we can assign tasks to you now? That's great.
I get the sash. I don't get the work.
Have either groups thought about, or Christy or the Texas group, have you guys thought about describing the web content, arranging and describing the web content in terms of discovery, and whether you'll sort of use the finding aid route or a different siloed page for that content? If there's any sort of thought into as you're planning.
That's a really good question. So from the University Archives historical preservation perspective, definitely coming up with a descriptive schema for that content and adapting what we currently use to describe much of our content, which is a qualified Dublin Core set of fields. But I think that a big part of that question, John, actually has to do with making the case for hiring some staff whose energies can be really focused on this, given the scale that it is, and given the QA, that Christy has described, and that's, there's just so much web content to go through, and thinking about whether that will be, one part-time, like a graduate research assistant, or a full-time web archiving librarian, and thinking about what makes the most sense, potentially surveying our peers about that specific issue. But I think that in terms of access, that's a really good question with the finding aid. That had not occurred to me, but I suppose you could definitely add an access point to whatever web portal you're going to use for people to view the captured sites, and add it to, create a web record series within the university department for which we already have an existing finding aid for. So that's an interesting proposal, but yeah, I have to say, we're not really there yet. I think the first step in our case will be to figure out strategies for how we're going to capture content moving forward beyond this sort of pre-crawl stage, and coming up with the way that we'll describe it, coming up with how we will provide staffing resources for it, and then the next step would be, where to put it in where does it fit into a traditional archival description. So
I will say that we are also very lucky that we have an information school at this university. So that may be another resource for us to have some iSchool students do projects related to figuring out some of these issues. We will certainly be inviting that.
Yeah, there might be opportunity for user studies. So if we did something like a pilot with a finding aid, we have a lot of class groups that do work with the Briscoe Center. So there's been a lot of talk about, with other born digital material, doing recent history with born digital material, like where does that, that's a broader access question, and this is sort of a subset of that. And so, doing maybe some user studies with students about if it's in the finding aid, was it easy to find, was it easy to get to the access portal? That's an interesting question. I think that's a good point too, Maryrose, is we've definitely incorporated iSchool students in the past to help us improve some of our online access services, so this could definitely be another thing that we would incorporate there, and give them an opportunity to work on web archiving.
I wanted to throw in a comment too. From an IT perspective, we are trying to come up with a solution on. We will have a new hosting platform. We should launch in August or early fall, and then the migration will begin from the old hosting platform. We want to have best practices and recommendations in place to do not move stuff, sites over that you do not have to. But we do not want people to just leave sites on the server. We want to reach a point where the server is empty, and I'm very excited about that. So we're talking about ways to come up with a new hosting platform, which is possibly archive.www.utexas.edu. So when a customer or a person who is hosting their website on our central hosting platform has to make a decision, do they migrate it to the new platform? Do they submit it for disposal to records management, or do they submit it for archives? And those latter two, if they were doing that, they would move it to this new place instead of leaving it around for us to throw out in 2 years. So it's an interesting plan, and we don't know what we're doing.
Another thing that I would add to what Jen was saying in regards to migrating content and access is that there's something called the Texas Administrative Code. And part of the migration for the University Communications web content is, well, not the migration, I guess in terms of building a whole new Drupal instance for themselves and creating these page templates that then these pages are dynamically created where HTML is printed in such a way. So meta tags, which many of us may be familiar with, they would include things like subject keywords or an abstract describing the content of the page. Oftentimes they're used by webmasters for search engine optimization anyway. And in thinking about that, kind of the possibility of that already being in place or working that into these page templates, that also meets requirements of our Texas Administrative Code. So there need to be these descriptive metadata elements at the top of each page template or the top of each sort of like new dynamically generated page content. And there are some ways that we've been talking about with University Communications Digital Content Group on how to do some of that work programmatically using some Drupal solution, creating sort of invisible metadata elements for each content type, like press release or news. So that's kind of another piece that would also help with access later on, because then you have these descriptive keywords that when you're going through and creating descriptive metadata for the object as an archival object, there's some of that metadata already in place.
Great. And Christie, sort of same question, questions on access, have you gotten there?
So Archive.it has a Dublin Core interface to allow you to input Dublin Core fields. I have not yet gotten to the point of deciding exactly how we're using each of them, and that is on the very near horizon to be done. Also, we need to make some decisions about any disclaimers that we're going to post. If you go and you view, for example, Archive.it partners, a lot of them use disclaimers about the captured content when they post it there. So we need to make a decision if we're going to be doing that sort of thing or not. I would also mention that our archives is in a process of transition for all of our description right now. We have traditionally had XML and HTML hosted just plain up on the web, and we're working toward moving into archive space. And so my hope would be at some point we're going to have something along the lines of archive space, which will be having metadata that then feeds directly into our catalog, and not having separate MARC records in our catalog. And I would like to have some sort of instance in archive space for the web content, whether that's under a collection or whether it's separate entities or something like that, but so that it ends up in our library catalog that we have these websites, and then it points back to where it's hosted. That's my vision. A couple years out for sure, but
Sounds good to me.
In the short term, doing the Dublin Core for sure. On the Archive.it hosted site, so that we have a portal and so you can find things within the portal.
Great, thank you.
We are nearing the end of our time together, so I want to make sure that we get one last question in. I'm interested in knowing what, if any, lessons learned you both might take away from your both groups might take away from your experiences, and either if you were doing this over, what wouldn't you do, or if you were doing this over, what would you absolutely do again?
I'll start from an IT perspective at UT. I would go back in time 20 years and put some guidelines in place.
Need a time machine is basically the answer to that question. I think from our perspective, one thing that I think we would absolutely do again is work together with the same representation that we have. So, you know, Jenn and Maryrose and I are at the table together today, but we also have, as we mentioned before, as John mentioned in the introduction, we have representation in our working group from university communications and from university libraries, including our institutional repository librarian, our scholarly communications librarian, Colleen Lyon, who has had done some previous experimentation working with student groups like Christie has, who actually came to her interested in seeing what was possible, what were the possible options for archiving their student blog. And so, you know, we knew that she had this experience, and bringing her in and saying, this definitely didn't work the way that we did it, but, you know, we've tried this other thing, or I've been thinking about this. And also, in having all those people at the table, you know, we don't all know what everyone on campus is doing. I mean, it's just big. You know, as Christie and we've talked about, both of our campuses are very decentralized. So it's great that we have each other, but having more people in the room has also proven that each of us knows a little bit about what everyone on campus is doing. So there are lessons to be learned out there that we can reach out to. Colleen's been able to reach out to archivists that she knew had pre-existing archivate subscriptions for very specific reasons, like the Human Rights Documentation Initiative. And we've been able to take advantage of some of their experiences doing that. But I would say that's one thing that we definitely do again.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. One more thing, instead of going back in time, it would be, and we are already working on the policy, which is more of there's a little bit of policy and a lot of best practices, recommendations, and how to do things. And so that is what we have learned, that we need to document this and to have a standard for the university, because we are so decentralized that it's not, we just can't tell people what to do. We have to provide them the information.
Just very briefly say that as a records manager of such an incredibly large institution, I'm always looking for ways to introduce records management concepts into places where records are being created. And this has been a wonderful and exciting opportunity for me to be able to introduce these, you know, necessary standards and requirements. So it's been a great experience for me. From a records management perspective.
How about you?
Yeah, well, for my part, I guess I would say that I am normally a planner. I'm normally one of these type of people who I would like to ideally know what Dublin core fields I'm going to be filling out about these things before I even go and collect them. And this was one of those circumstances where working with student groups, they turn over annually. So if you don't capture this year's website, it's gone. I just jumped in and started, I got their permission and just jumped in and started collecting it. And I would say that actually worked out really well, because I learned through that process kind of what was possible and what worked and what didn't work. So it was going against my typical grain of how I do things, but it worked really well in this case. Now, of course, I have to go back and figure everything out after the fact, and we're continuing to punch ahead. But yeah, so I would say that worked well for me in this particular case. Things I would do differently. I I think that this particular project, I had 5 undergraduates working for me and a graduate student who was supervising the 5 undergraduates, and they were the ones who were making the initial contact with the student groups and doing a lot of the legwork for me. I think in retrospect, I did not anticipate web archiving being such a big part of that project. And I think that had I anticipated that earlier, I think we could have done less intensive, but a greater quantity of interactions with student groups. We ended up doing actual accessions from only 7 groups, but we had contact with like 40. And so I think we could have put the web archiving at the forefront of that, and that would have been an easy get for a higher number of those groups rather than working on you know, their actual other types of records. Almost every one of them has a Google Drive, you know, things like that at the same time. So that I would have done differently, is putting the web archiving more front and center and running with it, because it is relatively easy to do. Not easy, relatively.
Well, I want to thank all of our participants, Jessica, Jenn, and Maryrose from the University of Texas at Austin, and Christie Peterson from Johns Hopkins. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and experiences with us. I think this was really helpful and insightful, and you guys took us to very deep places. And to those of you who are watching, again, if you'd like to see this, revisit it, watch it again. It'll be on the Records Management Roundtable's YouTube channel. We'll post a link to it on the Records Management Roundtable's blog as well. So thank you again. I hope everyone enjoys their day.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Kate and John and Christy. We're happy to be here today.
Thank you, guys. I learned so much. I'm glad I participated because I got to watch it too.
Ditto.
Bye.
Bye.